Welcome back to Software Without Borders. I'm Andy Hilliard, CEO of Accelerance. Today, we have Ryan Schauer, our Partner Success Manager, joining us as co-host.
Thanks, Andy. And we're thrilled to welcome Adam Rhuberg here to the show. Adam's a leader here in the analytics and data science space and has got over 15 years of experience. He's built and scaled high-performing teams at companies like Upwork and Jawbone. Adam will share with us today his wealth of knowledge in leading distributed teams and optimizing offshore strategies for data-intensive projects. Adam, again, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for having us, or thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Thanks for the intro and great to see you guys.
Hey, Adam, I always like to start at every show just by giving some context and a little bit of history and background. So can you trace your journey, from... And when you're tracing your journey, maybe you want to point out some seminal moments that sort of, created this intense interest and this desire to pursue a different path. I mean, we all hit forks in the road along our journey. They could be, foreseen or unforeseen. But I'd like to hear a little bit about your history, even, frankly, if you want to take it to your childhood or whatever had, influence on the path that you chose professionally.
Sure. Yeah. I won't go that far back necessarily, but, I think with many of us, as I was going through school, I was, really strong in math and science and thought, I need to do something along those lines. And, I went to school for engineering. And while I was in undergrad, I slowly made my way into the computer science program within the engineering school. And within that program, I ended up focusing on database design and database management. And so my career using SQL goes all the way back almost 30 years at this point to those classes I took in undergrad. And so when I graduated, I happened to go into supply chain consulting, but I worked in roles that were very data heavy. So I took use of my database knowledge, my SQL knowledge, and spent a few years in consulting projects that required making use of large sets of data from disparate sources, oftentimes in manufacturing contexts where we were scraping data from dozens and dozens of manufacturing facilities all across the country to figure out ways to aggregate that data and put it in a place where senior leadership could actually see, what are we buying? Who are we buying it from? What prices are we buying at? Where are we losing money, et cetera? So that's really what I did for roughly the first 6 years of my career. But then I decided to pivot a bit. My experience in consulting is the longer you're in it, you typically go down one of two paths. One, you are a career consultant, and you kind of head into the sales world of selling engagements, or you leave consulting for one of your clients, or at least in the industry that you most recently or most frequently worked in. For me, neither of those paths really fit that well. When I said manufacturing, a lot of it was automotive manufacturing. I was spending a lot of time in the Detroit suburbs. I wasn't really all that interested in jumping into an automotive career, and I didn't see myself as a high-level engagement leader in consulting projects, so I went back to business school. I majored in technology industry management while I was in business school. And when I graduated, I made the migration out to the Bay Area. I wanted to be in Silicon Valley. I wanted to work in tech. And the most natural place to work was in data analytics. And quite frankly, I wasn't even really aware of analytics back then as an actual job or a function. That really, kind of presented itself to me. And I realized, this is the natural inroad to get into tech.
And what year was that? And can you sort of trace back, because you mentioned, SQL and 30 years ago, can you trace back any sort of, shifts in the perception or the importance of data analytics that you may have missed, or you eventually sort of bought into, right? And you pursued that path?
Yeah. I think the big shift for me really came when I moved to the Bay Area. So this was 2009 when I graduated business school, and when I started working for eBay. And to contrast the massive streams of data that eBay was collecting with the world that I was dealing with when I was back in my manufacturing roles was, orders of magnitude different. In those early consulting roles, the level of data we were looking at was thousands of rows. It was a lot of it was just in Excel spreadsheets, and at the time, Excel had that 64,000-ish row limit, right? It wasn't even as expansive as it is today. The extent of the technologies that we would often get involved with back then were building out data applications in Microsoft Access. So it was, in a lot of ways, very sort of rudimentary compared to obviously where things are now, but even where things were in 2009. So fast forward to 2009, my first role at eBay, I was supporting the product team that owned the search results page. So it was a very narrow-minded focus, at least in terms of the expanse of the product. But that individual page that we owned saw 80 million daily hits. So there was nothing like that prior to that in my career that I ever saw or quite frankly, needed to understand. So the scale really changed dramatically. And for me, it felt overnight. But, a lot of that had to do with the industry change.
And can you describe exactly, how you made that transition and sort of what tools and skill set you brought to bear at eBay that allowed you to make that transition?
Yeah, well, I think the first and most obvious one was just having a real wealth of experience with SQL. It wasn't as widespread and well known even in 2009. And so having already been immersed in it for over a decade by the time I went to eBay just gave me the foundation that, said, I can pretty much do whatever you need me to do from a data perspective because I'm going to be able to figure out how to get my hands on it. So that was just the basic foundation that kind of opened the door. And just the years of experience, the fact that I went back to school and got a management degree gave me the ability to immediately get into a management role. So not only was I doing hands-on analytics at eBay, but I was also managing a team. And that's also where I began managing remote teams for the first time.
Can you, just before we get into that though, can you describe to me the similarities or even differences between your time, say, for example, at eBay and your time at Upwork, Elance, Odesk, and such like that, in terms of how data analytics is structured organizationally, who it reports to, who is it codependent on? It's just for the audience perspective, so we have an understanding of how different functions work together.
No, that's a good question because it does vary pretty dramatically by company. eBay was a massive company even at that time, and so very mature in a lot of ways, and especially in analytics. At the time that I was there, I think I took a lot about the eBay world and data ecosystem a bit for granted because I sort of assumed, well, this must be the way everybody does it, but definitely not. eBay had a very large analytics organization that rolled up into the finance department ultimately. So the CFO was kind of the boss's boss back then. Well, we had, at the time, about 100-person analytics team divided into buyer side analytics, seller side analytics, and then an advertising and marketing analytics team. So the idea there was that the team was largely divided based on the business stakeholders and how they organize their business. And so we were mimicking their buy side versus sell side division when it came to how the product organization was structured. Now, while we were a direct line into finance, we really had a lot of dotted line relationships into the stakeholders with whom we worked on a regular basis. So I mentioned that my role largely focused on supporting the search results page. So the product team that owned search results and the product managers who worked on that page, they were my day-to-day counterparts in terms of what's the priority for today and this week and this month? What are the new product ideas that we're planning on testing? What are the A/B tests that are live today that we need to analyze to figure out what's working and what's not, and what recommendations we make to senior leadership? So it was really the first time I dealt with the direct line relationship versus the dotted line relationship dynamic, and having to sort of balance those priorities.
And your direct report to the CFO or the finance organization is, what sort of KPIs were developed for you, and how are you held accountable in terms of the division between, say, delivering versus informing versus, is the organization and you specifically, are you delivering the value that the organization has defined? I mean, how is that defined? And
that's also a really good question. That's something that has evolved over time. So I would say my experience back at eBay is going to be a little different than probably what it even is today at eBay, or what I've seen more recently. Back then, so again, we're going back a little more than 15 years. Our KPIs were the KPIs of our clients, effectively, our product stakeholders. So we adopted whatever it was that they were trying to drive towards. There was a very specific metric that was sort of the golden metric of my time there at eBay, that was abbreviated as PPW, which was purchases per visitor per week. And so the idea there was that it would focus purely on purchase volume, while normalizing for traffic and how many people were actually coming to the site. So if the product team itself isn't really tasked with driving traffic, they can focus on maximizing the traffic that they're seeing, right? And so any A/B test that we conducted, our primary success metric was whether or not we were moving PPW. And signing up for quarterly and annual goals on driving PPW was a shared goal across organizations. And so that was true for the analytics org as well.
Interesting. And again, Adam, you've been working with us for a little bit. And again, thank you for helping contribute to our total cost ebook. I want to kind of ask a couple of questions from some of the things you put in there. For some follow-up, you mentioned earlier, right? You started working with distributed teams, offshore teams. I wanted to dive in a little bit about sort of the benefits and challenges you saw for, just the overall process of finding someone, selecting them, and actually working with them. And if you've made any, changes over time as far as how do you interact with distributed teams for software development.
My first foray into this was back in my time at eBay. In that scenario, I didn't have to do any of the searching. eBay had an office located in Chennai. So it just happened to be a team that was an extension of our own that I directly managed. And it wasn't until my time at Upwork that I began hiring much more frequently remote team members to join our analytics organization. Interestingly, the first time I really did it was when I was about to go on paternity leave. So we had a generous 12-week paternity leave policy, and I was about to take all of that in one large chunk. And in the run up to my leave, I built up a new team that at the time we called our data operations team. And the idea would be that this team would at least be able to handle all of the ad hoc data requests that I would get as part of my job, so that none of that would get dropped while I was out for 3 months. And what really worked for me in that scenario was hiring slightly more people than I actually needed in order to give myself room to have a trial period with all of them and figure out who were really going to be the ideal people to keep around for the longer term. And that's something that in my time at Upwork, we actually heard quite a bit as anecdotal feedback from some of our more successful clients, where they would, if they only had one role to hire for, they'd actually hire 2 short-term people, or maybe even 3, for a tiny little portion of ultimately what they wanted to do, to really figure out, who's the best one for the longer term work here? Who do I really want to hire as sort of an augmented staff member? And so I hired, at the time, I think I hired about 7 people. And I also hired them across a number of different geographies. My intent there was to try to build almost this sun's always up kind of scenario where there will always be somebody available and able to work in order to create around the clock coverage. So I had a couple of people in Ukraine. I had one or two in Philippines, one in India, two or three in South America. So it really was a really broadly distributed team. And my first month, but it was really kind of the month before I left for 3 months, was just a very intense evaluation and also training period to make sure that all of these people had the systems knowledge that I had in order to be able to kind of fulfill parts of my role while I was gone without having to have me as backup.
Can you describe a little bit about the time zone alignment or misalignment? I know in software development, that could be either a benefit or a liability, depending on how you structure the team. And obviously, there's been a lot of emphasis on time zone alignment, especially in software development, being a team sport and being sort of real-time collaboration. So sometimes follow the sun, opposite time zone misalignment doesn't work in software development as well, especially for smaller teams, I guess. But, and obviously in different functions where you can compartmentalize the work and train people, and you don't need to sort of have this real-time collaboration. Can you describe the type of work that allowed you to take advantage of follow the sun?
It is really contingent on the work or the product that you're trying to get out and whether or not it's time sensitive, obviously. A lot of the work that we did in analytics are things that would take days, if not weeks, to really put together. And so not having a fully aligned work schedule is something that can be managed around. I will say that, ideally you have at least a couple of hours overlap at either the beginning of your day or the end of your day in order to be able to complete daily stand-ups and be able to have more live Q&A and feedback sessions. Even in the case where, while I was in the California area, my India team was 12 and a half hours ahead. Now, they have, almost, at least within the tech sector, especially people who are frequently working with US-based tech companies, they have a proclivity is not really the right word, I think, but they've sort of acclimated themselves to working kind of odd hours for themselves in order to create a little bit more overlap. This was even the case during my eBay time. The Chennai office really only started lighting up around 2 p.m, and they would stay until midnight roughly. But if they were kind of working a long night, they'd stay until like 2 a.m. It wasn't uncommon to see a Domino's delivery come in the Chennai office at 1 a.m. It's just their kind of like regular workday. And so I found the same when I was hiring at Upwork, that creating that level of overlap and having some shifted hours is not uncommon for them. They're not, they're very amenable to it in a lot of cases. But then when you do have scenarios where something is more time sensitive, or you need the ability to do more live back and forth throughout the course of a business day, the truth is it's easier if you shift some of that either onshore or South America is a great option. I had plenty of success with analysts that I've hired in Brazil and Argentina and Peru.
How much of, we get a lot of customer questions about artificial intelligence, and, with your background, I see these two things being very, very intertwined. What are you seeing, from customers or just the marketplace as far as the executive level seriousness of organizing your data, tracking all your data, in attempt to move into more of an AI ready space? What are some of the things you've seen companies do or that you've done to get ready for the AI takeover, so to speak?
Yeah. So it's absolutely true that executives are very interested in it, even if we're still, potentially kind of shaking out from more of a hype cycle. The top-down mandate is largely a figure out how to use AI in what you're doing, because if you're not, somebody else will, and we're going to fall behind it. So it becomes a bit more of a search and discovery mission of what can we do in this space? How can we make use of AI in a way that we think is going to work for us? When it comes specific to the analytics world, there's a challenge there in that you can't just plug in AI and have it churn out the right answers for the things that you're trying to get to, because any AI bot or agent needs the foundational data that it learns from in order to be able to create useful output. And the problem with having foundational information about your data ecosystem is that oftentimes it's not really all that well documented. It's living in people's heads. The engineer who built the product is the only one that knows what record ID number means in a specific table and which other tables it joins to. So you can't just throw an AI bot in there and expect it to be able to just sort of comb the entire data warehouse and make immediate sense of it. And so what that means is that it's forcing people to start building that necessary metadata in order to enable it. And there's a couple of different angles, at least that I was able to see in terms of how you can make that work. One is creating the metadata repositories that explain your tables and explain your fields and explain all of your data so that there is something for it to learn from. So you're building data catalogs in a way that previously were more just like a nice to have. This data catalog, if it was complete and up to date, would be great for the next analyst that we hire, because then they don't have to do as much work to figure out how to put all these things together in the future. But now if your leadership is saying, figure out how to make AI work for us in this data ecosystem, then that data catalog just becomes not a nice to have anymore, but an absolute necessity. And creating processes that ensure that you're constantly keeping it up to date are also now a necessity, right? So it's not just some like big undertaking that you do once. You get everybody pulled in for a year, you get it to a baseline, and then it gets kind of forgotten about and becomes stale and out of date, and then people stop using it again. So that's one side, the data catalog piece. The other side is when it comes to sort of the technical piece, the SQL area. A big area of, at least from what I can see so far, this hype area is text to SQL, where I just explain to you the question. I just type out, I want to know how many customers do we have in this particular area that have done X, Y, and Z. And an AI agent can't write the SQL for that if it, one, doesn't have a full understanding of the data catalog. It also probably needs to have a historical repository of previous SQL statements that were already written that it can pull from in order to kind of, regurgitate that language for you. And so you have to, you almost have to go around to all the analysts and say, can you give me all of the good queries you've ever written that you've saved for yourself that also have a good description of what it is that it's answering and what data it's returning, so that we can create this other repository for, a large language model to read over and learn from in order to, enable that functionality. So I think, at least in terms of the data space, I think the industry is very much in a, what do we need to do right now to properly enable these incredibly valuable tools that my leadership wants me to use, but I can't really use right now because some of the underlying stuff just isn't there yet.
Do you see a lot of companies then pushing to update, I guess, their overall, how they're tracking their data and how they're storing their data so it can be sort of AI friendly? Like I think we're seeing it now, like even in the government, storing Social Security information on, I think like COBOL, and now, they're running checks saying that they're paying, 300-year-old people Social Security checks every month based off the data that they're pulling. And everything I'm reading, those are like COBOL-based databases, I think, or there's super old databases and the AI is not able to read it. So are companies going to have to make that investment in sort of how they're storing and maintaining their data before they move into that space?
I mean, that's absolutely true, especially for these older legacy systems. This is going to be the kick in the butt that they need in order to migrate onto newer systems, right? Like you can kind of keep patching things together with duct tape and glue for only so long until you want to make use of these more sophisticated technologies.
Yeah, I was thinking that maybe some of the older technologies are harder to hack or are more less prone to nefarious manipulation. I could be wrong with that. But yeah, I have a question in regards to how you manage expectations and how you explain things to executives and stakeholders that are obviously lapping up the hype cycle of AI and the potential of AI. Also, the fear of either the fear of falling behind and the aspirations of leading their competitive set of companies and making sure that they're on the forefront. It in a tectonic shift like we're experiencing right now, and in a function like yours, how do you set correct expectations, manage expectations? How have you seen it sort of been a difficult path to pursue? And just how do you maintain alignment?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes, that is difficult to manage those expectations, especially with just the speed with which these AI tools are coming out, and you're seeing companies leverage them in interesting ways. Creates the perception that you can just fire up an LLM and you're immediately going to have this amazing output that you can make use of all the time. And obviously the reality is trickier than that. And you can't just tell executives like, here are all the reasons why I can't do that right now, and here's why it's going to take 6 to 9 to 12 months. So there's really kind of a twofold approach here, I think, that works really well. First of all, you need to get alignment on what the actual end product or solution is supposed to look like, right? Let's all agree on the thing that we want to build, that we think we can build, before we just kind of just like throw around these sort of pie in the sky terms that we may not be all that familiar with right now. That's one. And then two is to make sure that within those set of kind of solutions that you'd like to create and build, hopefully being able to identify one or two that might be quick wins, where you can actually make use of the technology much sooner to show what you can do, in order to give yourself the runway to do the more complicated things. And with the more complicated things, that's probably where more of the value is ultimately going to be, but it's going to take longer. You're going to need a roadmap. You're going to have a very clear set of, a stage gate process with, this is what we're going to deliver by this time, and I'll give you regular updates, and this is what we're going to deliver. But to focus on only those long-term ones and say, here's a 3-quarter roadmap that I've created for getting there, isn't really going to whet anybody's appetites necessarily, unless you can also say, but look, here's one thing that I was able to do. Go play with this. This is going to work great, and kind of hold you over for a little while. And a scenario where we actually did that at Upwork, because I was working effectively directly for the CFO, we were sort of overseeing more than just analytics for the product team and the marketing team and operations and trust and safety, but we were also helping to support finance and accounting, et cetera. And so one of the quick wins that my team identified was in helping our investor relations team. Basically anytime any competitor or a company that we watched very closely would have their earnings call and statements, we built a little bot that would ingest all of their documents and then spit out a 1-page summary that was effectively the thing our head of IR used to do every time an earnings report came through, completely manually, after reading the entire document and then writing like an email for executives to say, here's what's important. Here's what you should know about XYZ company. So we use all of our previous examples that have ever been written up and sent around as the learning space for this bot, and then began testing it as new earnings reports were coming in live, turning around those summaries much more quickly than this single person in IR was able to do, and effectively leverage the voice that was used in all of the historical versions to create something that looked almost undiscernible from what the human counterpart was doing. And really, it was just a massive time saver, right? For a team that fluctuated between 1 and 2 full-time people working within the IR department. And it was something, obviously, like that part of their job was a thing that happens with incredible velocity for like a 3-week period, and then it kind of goes away, right? So it's the sort of thing that they would put their head down and just work for days and days and days, churning out these earnings report summaries. And now we were able to develop a bot within a couple of weeks to basically replace that entire work stream. And having something like that gives you the ability to build out longer term roadmaps for more complicated things.
Do you feel that today, especially, that data analytics functions need to account for a lot more due diligence and vetting of solutions in terms of people investment, money investment, investment in researching, sandboxing, thinking and testing new approaches to the function overall, just because of the introduction of AI and the inundation that we're all experiencing in regards to solutions that are going to fix every problem and make you ultimately successful?
Yes and no. Like, what I see that I think is very interesting is that all of the leading analytics and data solutions providers that we interact with and that we see very frequently are themselves trying to figure out how to bundle AI features into what they're building. And so to some degree, you could sort of just sit along for the ride and make use of the new features and functionality that they're bringing along with you. The reality is that if you're kind of stuck in a tech stack that's really not developing in that way, then that is where you get into a bit of a trickier discussion, right? Because then you're talking about, what's the new evolution of tools that we need to start investing in? Where do we need to move to in order to be able to take advantage of that, right? So while we were at Upwork, we had migrated to Snowflake a couple of years ago. If we were still on the old legacy technology today and wondering, what do we need to do in order to take advantage of AI? We'd have to be thinking about a massive migration effort to a completely new vendor and evaluate lots of different tools. And yes, spend a significant amount of time, energy, and money going through proofs of concept and trial periods with a lot of different vendors. But at least being on a more forward-thinking technology, we're already testing the AI features that they're building. So we can say that we are also embracing AI, and here's how we're doing it, even if it's just a new feature set that we now have access to that was built by, our current vendor that we already have in place.
That makes perfect sense. I'm interested in your time at Upwork. I think you had roles in both marketing and product data analytics, and I'm not sure if you could describe a little bit about how those roles differed, and also I'm sort of interested in this one experience about you building this internal data sciences team that focus on lifetime valuation predictions. Can you talk a little bit about those two areas?
Yeah. So to talk about just sort of the different functions, interestingly, when I was first hired there, my job was as an analyst in the marketing team. And I just was effectively the one person in marketing that knew how to write SQL. So I was doing anything and everything that was required across all of marketing to just get people answers about what was happening on our platform. Over time, as the company grew, the team grew, we went through a merger. When I first joined the company, it was known as Odesk. Elance was our number one competitor. And about a year into my tenure there, we merged and brought both of these organizations together. And in going through that merger, I left the marketing organization and joined the centralized analytics function within finance. And so from that time forward, my role continued to evolve and change constantly, just in terms of who the various internal stakeholder teams were that I and my team supported. The questions that we get asked are obviously very different between marketing and product. On the product side, it's very much trying to understand how users are interacting with the product. The majority of time is really spent on A/B testing, preparing for doing the early analyses to understand who's going to be impacted, how big of a test we need to run, how long it needs to run for, monitoring the tests as they're live, and then analyzing the tests once they've concluded in order to try to understand, did it work or not? Should we roll it out? If it didn't work, why not? What are the things that people were doing? How are they responding to it? What can we learn for the next test? That's largely the focus on the product side. On the marketing side, it's actually a little more varied than that. Some of it is, please help me understand the channel mix distribution of our incoming client acquisition funnel and how different channels perform differently at various steps throughout the onboarding flow, to supporting the CRM team and efficacy of our email campaigns or our push notifications. Within those, obviously, there's the A/B testing that goes on as well, but it's a bit of a different flavor. Oftentimes, working with our third-party CRM vendors to orchestrate those things, as opposed to doing it internally with an internally built testing product. But with the marketing team support, that's really where the lifetime valuation work comes into play. The easiest and most straightforward example is as it relates to search engine marketing. So what should I be spending for an SEM click, knowing that a new customer acquisition is worth X? And if my CFO tells me that I need to get 100% return on my investment within, say, 1 year, what I really need to understand is what is the value that we're generating within 1 year of a new client being acquired versus the cost to acquire. And the predicting lifetime value is very complicated. And actually at Upwork, there are nuances that are just inherent to a marketplace business, much more complicated than either a Amazon style shopping cart experience versus a SaaS subscription business, right? Like at scale with SaaS subscription business, you know what your subscription rates are and you know what your churn rates are, and it's very easy to figure out what is my revenue going to be with a new customer acquisition in 1 year or 3 years, et cetera. As long as those things stay fairly stable and are, incredibly chaotic. But with Upwork, we just had a much greater variety in the types of users that come in the front door. There are plenty of people that come in that are one and dones by intent. They just have one project idea in their head and they just want to hire one person to help get it done. And that's it. There are other people that are showing up and they might look like one and dones, but really what they're doing is trial, testing, dipping their toes in the water. And maybe if things go well from their perspective, they're going to hire a whole lot more people, or they're going to hire this person for an extended period of time. And then there are people that really do come in with an intention around building up a function that they just don't have. They don't have internally. They don't have time to build. They don't have the expertise in building, and they'd rather, effectively outsource the entire function and have freelancers who operate as nearly full-time members of the team. And so across all of those, fairly bucketized personas, which do not capture all of the various nuances, the value that you're going to get out of them is dramatically different. And the likelihood that someone will just go from one project to two dramatically changes the future course of their trajectory, right? It's very easy to calculate lifetime value of someone who's only going to come in and do one logo design project, right? But if someone is coming in with the potential to do software development with a large distributed team, and they're going to do it for months and months, if not years, that value curve skyrockets. And those are the types of people that we would want to say, make sure that we are putting our search engine ads in front of very prominently. We're going to pay more for them. And so customer lifetime value is not one value per acquisition, right? It's got to be a much more sophisticated prediction based on at least as many input variables as we can get our hands on early on to try to understand who they are and the kind of work that they're trying to do. And that's where...
What did you do?
Well, that's where the data science comes in.
Yeah.
There are some things that are very easy that for a long time we had fairly consistent rubrics and less sophisticated models that we could use and do some level of slicing and dicing to get to a value for particular segments. And the easy examples is this, I'm speaking entirely on the client side of the equation here for Upwork, the people who are coming in and looking to hire. A client in the US is our most valuable client compared to clients starting in many other countries, with Australia, Canada, and UK kind of coming in a fast second, third, and fourth. If they're coming to hire specifically in high-tech categories or software development categories, they're going to be higher value than someone who's coming to do writing or translation or graphic design.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Someone who's showing an indication to hire hourly work versus fixed price work, they're likely to spend more.
Of course.
Because they need to have longer term contracts. Somebody who registers with a business email address instead of personal, they're probably going to spend more money.
Makes sense.
Probably have just a larger size of wallet, right? Whereas the personal is personal projects, kind of one-off side projects, side hustles, things like that. So early on, for many years, we could create almost like a very detailed spreadsheet with lots of these different dimensional cuts and give you a rough value estimate for each one of them and say, this is what you should be willing to go out to pay to acquire a client like this. But again, that doesn't capture any of the nuance within any one of those individual buckets. If those buckets are likely to be a one and done, there are plenty of those buckets that you're going to spend way too much bringing that person in the front door than if they have a likelihood or a tendency to, or a need or intent to hire for long-term or for multiple projects. And so where the data science model can come in there is that it can be, one, something that is live, always learning, always on, and able to continue to refresh value at an individual customer level based on new things that they're doing. So, for example, if I have a new client that comes in the door for the first time and they register and maybe they even go so far as to post a job, but then don't ever log in again to the website, the only way we're really even going to be able to get that person to successfully convert is probably through some of our email campaigns where we say, hey, we found a bunch of freelancers who would be great for your job. Why don't you come back and look at them? But the person who logs back in multiple times within the next 24 days and is reviewing applicants, that person has just told us a wealth of knowledge about their level of intent, their likelihood to begin spending in the first place, which leads to a higher likelihood of being a long-term spender. And so we can ingest those additional signals in real time and continue to update those individual predictions at an individual customer level to understand what we really truly believe that value is for that individual user. So when we get two people that come in and everything looks the same early on in terms of where they're located and their IP address sort of points to like a business address and they use a business email domain and they're looking at freelancers that are PHP developers, we could say, hey, we're going to spend $300 on a search engine ad for both of those guys, but one of them actually posts a job and comes back a bunch of times, and that next day, the other one just completely disappears and ghosts us. Maybe there are some other signals that we could have learned and put into that model to do better the next time, but also it gives us the ability to continue to do future interventions that maybe are worth putting some rebates or some cashback or some like $20 incentive to spend $100 kind of things to help grease the wheels with that second client I described who is showing slightly higher levels of intent. And if we help to grease the wheels a little bit, we can actually realize that predicted customer lifetime value or make it more likely that they're going to, head into that top 10 percentile tier of client spenders on the platform. So with more sophisticated modeling, you open yourself up to more nuanced predictions at a more granular level, and you give yourself the ability to factor in a lot more in more real time than you would be able to do when you're just tasking your one single marketing analyst with, tell me how much this one customer is worth and how much I should be willing to spend to reactivate them or incentivize them.
How do you wrap up these this learning and these tests into a periodic executionable recommendations to various functions and stakeholders? What is the expectation? Because there's a lot of behind the scenes work in your department in reaching these conclusions and stating these new insights, which then need to be defined and executable for the company in order to reap the benefits of what you've learned. So I'm always curious about at what point and what frequency, what cadence do these time boxes have in order to make sure that your stakeholders are feeling like that this is adding value to the organization?
First of all, I don't think anybody is going to argue that building a customer lifetime valuation model is not something that a company needs and should put resources behind. But if there's not a planned set of steps that are going to be done with that deliverable, if there's not something tangible that it will be executed that a partner team is committing to, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to devote time and effort to it, right? It's not something you're going to put at the top of your prioritization list because it's like, for who, for what? Why did I build this thing, right? And so in that particular scenario, we're working directly with our stakeholders in the CRM group within marketing because they had a very specific intent. They wanted to, one, they wanted to refine their bidding strategy for SEM, but two, they also wanted to embark in some incentive campaigns for reactivation campaigns for potentially lapsed customers or customers that were at risk of churning. And those incentive campaigns need to have an understanding of what is the estimated customer lifetime value today, and what is it if we actually make this offer? And so how can I use the money the CFO is giving me in a way that's ROI positive, right? So we had a clear stakeholder and they had clear objectives and they knew what they wanted to do with it. Working backwards from that, you then have to figure out, okay, I need to be able to prove this works. So we're going to have to be building for the purposes of creating a test. And in order to do that, we have to build a model that is something that we can put into production and execute on an A/B test to say, here's this holdout group that's just going to get some kind of generic email, but they're part of our kind of target audience. And here's this other group that we're actually going to go after. We're going to give them the incentive and we're going to see how this works. And so from a timeline perspective, after you actually decide, here's what we're going to do with this thing, this is why we need it to be built, here's how we need to build it in order to be able to execute a test, you then, obviously you need a roadmap. You need to say, like, this is how long it's going to take us to build out this model. The first version is really just going to be a historical evaluation that shows, here's what we would have said and here's what actually happened so that you can work on fine-tuning the model. You need to build that into your roadmap so you can take that back to your stakeholders and say, like, hey, this was the part where we were building and testing, right? And now this is the part where we have set aside for refinement and like searching for new variables that we may have missed in order to improve accuracy. All of that has to be framed with some sort of success metric that you define in advance, some sort of accuracy measure as it relates to how good do you think the model is doing and actually predicting real value that you're seeing. And so that forces the conversations with your stakeholders around timing about, the first one we did, it was, only 85% and we promised 94%. So here's what we're going to do in the next iteration. The next set of results you're going to see from us in 2 weeks. And then we'll have a check-in then and we'll talk about what the new results look like. When we reach that threshold, that's when we can begin executing on steps 2, 3, and 4, right? In order to figure out how working with these other teams in order to put it in production and actually test it, and then run the length of the A/B test as long as it actually needs to run in order to present the results back. To address the question around like the other teams that you work with, ultimately we do need to work with an application team and the back-end engineering team to say like, here is a data science model we developed, and we need you to basically put a wrapper around this so that it's got an API endpoint that's available for all of these other tools that we're going to use so that we can do X, Y, and Z. So we have to be part of their roadmap as well, right? And so we have to be keeping them in the loop. So the reality is that you sort of need one of these little like tiger teams with representatives across each of the different organizations that need to be involved so that the ultimate work is all on everybody's roadmaps.
Like in the product world, it's a product owner who is a liaison between, the development and the product team. What is it in your world?
If it was a product focus concept, then yes, it would be the product manager. In this scenario, it's either going to be the leader on the marketing side, whoever the leader is in CRM, who's saying like, this is what I need to build and here's why, and this is why I had built in from leadership. It may actually come from analytics, because sometimes analytics is a little bit more well-versed in the language of the engineers and the back-end folks that need to actually build the thing to make it function. So I've seen it kind of work both ways, depending on the technical know-how of the marketing person that you're working with and the seniority of the marketing person that you're working with. And then ultimately, the way we worked was we followed a bit of like the Amazon memo idea. This was something that I think Jeff Bezos really loved and rolled out with an iron fist around. Every meeting begins with a 6-page memo, and everyone's heads down reading this thing and marking it up and writing questions and silent contemplation. And then after whatever 15 or 20 minutes it takes to read through that 6-page memo, then it's Q&A time, and let's just clear things up. And so we really embraced that wholeheartedly for many years. And so the outcome would inevitably be a 6-page memo that explained the problem, explained the solution, and explain the recommendation, what we're going to get out of it, how much we could potentially make or win or what have you, and put it to leadership and say, this is what we want to do. This is what we're really smart. And that's kind of the way that you socialize it. You get the executive buy-in, and also you sort of market yourselves internally around the hard work that was done and the wins that you were able to create. And all of the internal stakeholders that were involved in ushering it to its conclusion.
Interesting. I'm wondering if you can write those memos today using AI to customize them for a certain function or a certain role within an organization. It's still all the same information, but it's written in a way that it's catered to a CEO versus a CFO versus a product manager versus because everyone has their own languages.
For sure. And I think there's one aspect of that that's an absolute yes. It's here are the hundreds of memos that have ever been written here before, or maybe here are the 50 that are the gold star, the best ones. And that's your training set for this future memo writing. But in terms of directing them to a different audience, the way we use them, and I think was sort of the Amazon style, was everybody is in the meeting together, all reading the memos at the exact same time. And this was something that goes back to obviously like the pre-pandemic phase, where we literally would start meetings with a hard copy of a document in front of everybody at the table, and nobody was allowed to be on a laptop. And it was just 15 or 20 minutes in a conference room of pure silence.
That's brilliant. I mean, I've heard this before, and I've read it before, and I've looked at it before. But then when you just describe it in action, I'm thinking, gosh darn, that's a really smart approach.
It is. I mean, I think that's why it seemed to have worked so well on Amazon and so why other companies adopt it. But it's very difficult to like maintain the discipline to do it well. It's an easy thing to slip away from over time if your leadership isn't very insistent upon it.
With that, talking about distributed teams and everything, you mentioned before you've worked with those teams. I'd love to get your feedback, given accelerants is working with outsourcing teams, distributed teams. Your experience overall working in this distributed fashion, right? Pre-COVID, everyone's together. Post-COVID, everyone's really distributed. And even before COVID, you probably worked with some distributed teams. What was your overall experience and why was it either, good or bad?
The overall experience was incredibly positive, and it's something that I would absolutely do again. And at any opportunity in the future at companies I work at, I would figure out ways to take advantage of it. As I think the way I would put it, it's less of a mandatory, let's outsource everything we can, but more of a, what are the right places where this would be most appropriate? And there's obvious benefits around potential cost savings and this idea of like following the sun and having some always on capabilities. The willingness to go abroad and remote, you open yourself up to a vastly larger talent pool. So you cannot discount that fact, right? Like, it's not necessarily true that we just happen to have all the best engineers here in the US, but we're willing to, cut some corners in order to hire somebody in another country. Like, I can tell you,
85% of engineers are outside the US.
Yeah, I can tell you that like some of the most successful technical people that we had at Upwork were just pouring out of Eastern Europe, right?
Sure.
And to shut yourself off from that talent pool is in itself a mistake, right? And if there are some cost savings with that, I think that's sort of added icing on top of that. There are definite downsides, obviously. The time zone thing is something that I think you can manage around as long as it's not I need to be in constant communication with you for 8 straight hours a day, if and when necessary. But, there's also like the geopolitical risks that you can't discount. When Russia invaded Ukraine, Upwork, along with many other companies, decided to shut out Russia and Belarus from being able to use our platform. And we had Upwork freelancers working for Upwork that were located in those places. And some of them relocated in order to continue working with us, and some of them didn't, and we had to completely shut them off. But that's a legitimate concern. I had a team of 4 personally working in Ukraine. They happened to be more in Western Ukraine, so they weren't directly impacted on a day-to-day basis. They were able to continue working for me during the time that I was still there, but their lives were greatly impacted by this. They were running weekend supply truckloads to the front lines as like a side hustle for them, not to devalue what it was they were doing with that terminology, but they were still working for Upwork while clearly having a whole lot of other really critical things in their lives hanging over their heads, and still were. Even working with folks in places like Philippines, Bangladesh, countries in other countries in Southeast Asia, it was not uncommon for some natural disaster to hit. A flood, a tsunami, plenty of issues like that would knock people offline for days, if not weeks. And we were impacted internally, but a lot of our clients were also impacted when those things happened. And I can recall a lot of times that we just did personal outreach to clients that had active engagements with freelancers in some of those countries, where we had to get in front of them and say like, hey, like, I don't know if you realize what just happened this morning, but it's very likely that these 3 folks who are working for you might be directly in this line of fire of this monsoon, and either be more patient with your deliverables or reach out to them and find out if they're okay, which we've done as well. So those kinds of things are going to happen randomly, and you sort of need to potentially have contingency plans or backup plans to be able to respond when those things happen. But all that being said, the flexibility that it gives you, and the ability to tap into these additional resources is just, those benefits far outweigh the negatives. And I would absolutely do it over and over again.
Yeah, to a couple of these points. So you mentioned flexibility, scalability, resiliency, redundancy, things like that. natural disasters happen everywhere. They can happen everywhere. They happen here in the U.S. too, obviously. But one thing I've noticed is that distributed teams, the members in general, there is less likelihood of turnover because the demand for digital talent here in the U.S. far outstrips the supply, which is, again, pointing to the 85% reside outside the U.S. Not to mention the ability to work for say a client in the U.S. or Western Europe or Australia is such a unique, special, prime opportunity for people that are in other countries. And also they come culturally from a mentality of more sort of continuity where, Americans and Western cultures seem to be, there's a lot of demand for our services and it's relatively easy to switch or to move on. And we just have this mentality of like churn and burn and use and dispose where, I've often found over 30 years that if you obviously build the right culture of empowerment, of inclusion, of integration, that you reap the benefits of continuity and lower turnover over time. Now, if you treat a partner or an internal unit like a widget, client's vendor or master servant type of relationship, binary type of relationship, well, that pretty much turns off anyone, and it takes the specialness out of the organization, whether or not it's full-time people or working in a partnership. So, people are people, but it depends on how you build relationships, how you build culture, how you build empowerment, accountability, and things like that you can really start to reap benefits with, globalized workforce.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Again, to speak to that and to specifically reference the team of mine that was working out of Ukraine, I hired them, I want to say in 2016 it was, roughly, just before I took that paternity leave. And 3 of them were still with the company at least into 2023, which by the time I left the company, after me, they were the longest tenured employees that we had. Because the full timers, a lot of people are 2 to 3 years and bouncing around, especially in Silicon Valley, and back in, I want to say it was roughly 2018, 2 of those folks from Ukraine on their own dollar were coming to the U.S. to just kind of go on vacation, but also travel around a little bit. And they wanted to come visit the Upwork headquarters, and so I came. They came and I hosted them for a day. And they even came to my house and had dinner with my wife and my kids. And that was kind of just like a wild, bringing everything full circle, right? Like they're not just, they're not just outsourced labor. They are like legitimate, valuable team members who contribute in meaningful ways. And, just because they're, on the other side of the world, doesn't mean it's a non-starter.
I love that idea. And in fact, we readily promote, if not, nearly mandate that teams are meeting one another, breaking bread, understanding cultures, appreciating people to the degree of what motivates them, what energizes them, what makes them happy, how do their lives function. Just an authentic interest in other people's lives does incredible things in terms of the stickiness and continuity of relationships, lowering turnover. It's just that it really, it's, what I always say is like, you have to do what others will not do or are unable to do. If you as a servant leader can invest the time and energy to commit and empower and get to know people on your team, regardless of where they're at, in ways, it could be physical interaction, it could be traveling to them or them traveling to you, or just, breaking bread. We get false flags from interacting now with the advent of video conferencing and real-time communication to think that that's similar or adequate to building relationships. And it is to a certain degree, and it's been a great benefit to all of us. But if you really want to build a more bulletproof, resilient, strong community, you need to go beyond that.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Well, look, Adam, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your valuable insights, leadership, and offshore strategies, and talking about the future of data management. I just want to say that to all of our listeners, we really appreciate you listening to Software Without Borders. If you're interested in learning more about data and analytics, offshore software development, or the latest trends in data management, please be sure to subscribe to our show and leave us a review.